The FBI believes Hoffa was murdered by mobsters, but who was the trigger man? For 50 years, the world asked one question: what happened to Jimmy Hoffa? What happened to Jimmy Hoffa? What happened with Jimmy Hoffa? Now in 2025, scientists have finally solved the mystery, and it's far worse than anyone imagined. A chilling discovery beneath a New Jersey highway has shaken the country, and even Jesse Waters called it the most disturbing revelation in modern crime history. This wasn't solved by the FBI or a mobster's confession. It was science, and a witness who waited 5 decades to speak. What they uncovered has rewritten history and exposed how close we came to losing the truth forever. The Jimmy Hoffa mystery is no longer unsolved. On July 30, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa left his house in Bloomfield Township, Michigan around 1:15 p.m., wearing a dark suit and his usual no-nonsense expression. He was headed to the Marshu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, a suburban steakhouse just north of Detroit. The meeting was supposed to be with 2 men he knew well, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, both of them deeply rooted in the Teamsters and entangled in the mob. Hoffa told his wife he'd be back by dinner. He never came home. That was the last confirmed sighting of the most powerful labor leader America had ever seen. One moment he was sitting in a parking lot near the restaurant, possibly waiting or already confronting someone, and the next he was gone. No body. No confirmed crime scene. No final words. Just a running car, a pair of glasses left behind, and silence. To understand why his disappearance sparked such chaos, you have to understand who Hoffa really was. He wasn't just the president of the Teamsters. He was the man who turned the union into an empire. Hoffa commanded power through a mix of working-class loyalty and criminal intimidation. He negotiated with presidents and mafia bosses alike. For years, he was the connection between American industry and the underworld, and everyone knew it. But knowing and proving are 2 very different things. In 1967, Hoffa was sentenced to 13 years in prison for jury tampering, fraud, and bribery. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence under the condition that he not engage in union activity until 1980. Hoffa, of course, ignored that. By 1975, he was attempting a comeback, making calls, arranging meetings, trying to claw his way back to power. And that made people nervous, very powerful people who had everything to lose if Hoffa returned. The timeline of his last day is as precise as it is eerie. He arrived at the Red Fox shortly before 2 p.m. By 2:15, he was reportedly pacing the parking lot, frustrated. By 2:45, witnesses say he was gone. His car, a green 1974 Pontiac Granville, was found still parked the next morning. Inside were his personal belongings, untouched. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No note. Just an open mystery that seemed to get darker with every passing year. The FBI launched what would become one of the longest-running and most expensive investigations in its history. They chased tips from New Jersey to Florida, dug up fields, drained lakes, and surveilled mobsters. But no one ever stood trial, and no physical evidence was ever recovered, not a single bone. As the years passed, theories piled up like gravel on an unmarked grave. Some believed he was incinerated in a mob-connected crematorium. Others claimed he was buried in the foundation of a Detroit stadium. A few said he was fed to pigs. There were even whispers of government involvement, that maybe Hoffa knew too much and trusted too many people on both sides of the law. But for all the noise, one fact remained constant: no one could prove what happened. It became a cold case so legendary it took on a life of its own. Generations grew up hearing about Hoffa's fate as urban myth, the ultimate American riddle. And with every year that passed, the possibility of answers faded a little more. Until now. Chris Franzblau didn't set out to solve the Jimmy Hoffa mystery. In fact, most of his legal career had very little to do with high-profile disappearances or unsolved murders. But what made Franzblau different from other attorneys in his field was his memory. He remembered everything: cases, conversations, even glances exchanged in courtrooms that most people would have forgotten the next day. And when it came to Hoffa, he remembered more than he probably should have. He was already a seasoned New Jersey attorney by the time Hoffa vanished in 1975, known for defending mob-connected clients and navigating the murky back channels of the legal system. Franz Blau wasn't flashy, but he had a reputation for being methodical, calculated, and more than anything, curious. When Hoffa disappeared, it wasn't just another news story to him. It was personal. Not because he knew Hoffa directly, but because he knew the type of men Hoffa was dealing with, and he knew how those kinds of stories usually ended. Over the years, Franz Blau worked with and around people who at one point or another had been linked to the Teamsters, to organized crime, or to both. In quiet conversations behind closed doors, his clients would say things. Little details. Casual asides. Half-truths laced in bravado or whispered fear. Nothing concrete. Nothing that could be taken to court. But Franz Blau collected them anyway. He kept journals. He asked questions that didn't sound like questions. And above all, he never stopped paying attention. By the 1990s, most people had given up on the Hoffa case. It was old news, a cold trail buried under decades of media noise and false leads. But Franz Blau couldn't shake the feeling that something about the official narrative didn't add up. He remembered which places had been searched, and more importantly, which ones hadn't. He remembered a client who once talked about a construction site that had suddenly shut down in late 1975. He remembered the look on that man's face when Franz Blau casually asked, "What happened there?" He didn't get an answer. Not then. But the silence told him everything. Franz Blau never tried to become the center of the Hoffa story. He never went on television or published wild theories. He was a lawyer, not a showman. Still, behind the scenes, he followed the case like a man watching smoke rise from a house no one realized was still burning. When the FBI announced their latest dig near the Pulaski Skyway in 2022, Franz Blau shook his head. They were close, but they weren't looking in the right spot. He knew that much. But he also knew that no one would take him seriously unless he had something more than memory and speculation. He told a few colleagues he was working on a book, a final account of his career, something to keep his mind sharp. He called it The Last Mob Lawyer. It was meant to be a collection of courtroom stories, legal insights, maybe even a few name drops for old time's sake. But as he started putting pen to paper, something shifted. The Hoffa case, which had always lived at the edge of his memory, started pushing its way to the front. It refused to be just another chapter. It demanded attention.